In 1845, a British expedition set out to complete one of the greatest geographic challenges of the age, the Northwest Passage. The route, threaded through the Arctic islands of northern North America, promised a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific. The ships chosen for the mission were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, both Royal Navy vessels already hardened by earlier service. Their commander was Sir John Franklin, a respected officer whose name was tied to the prestige of British exploration. On paper, the expedition looked impressively prepared. The ships carried preserved food, steam engines for limited auxiliary power, heating systems and supplies meant to sustain a long Arctic campaign. There was confidence in the venture, and for good reason. This was not a desperate gamble by amateurs, but a well-funded imperial mission sent out by one of the world's strongest naval powers. Yet Arctic exploration had a way of humbling even the most confident plans. In those waters, technology, rank, and preparation could all be reduced by distance, weather, and ice. The expedition left England in May of 1845 and moved northward in stages. For a while, it remained part of the visible world, observed and discussed like any other voyage of national importance. The last confirmed European sighting came later that summer, when whalers saw the ships in Baffin Bay. After that, the expedition passed beyond the edge of ordinary reporting and into the silence that would define its fate. No one on those decks could have known that this would be the final confirmed meeting. What followed would leave only fragments: a note, scattered objects, human remains, and a mystery that endured for generations. The route ahead led through a maze of channels, islands, and sea ice. In theory, it was navigable. In practice, it depended on narrow windows of movement and on surviving winters that could trap ships for months. The first winter in the Arctic may not have looked like disaster at all. Expedition life in such conditions often meant routines, measurements, repairs, rationing, and the steady effort to keep order while the world outside froze solid. But order inside a trapped ship could hide the larger truth outside. Each month of immobility meant the ice was deciding the pace of the expedition, not the men who had come to command it. The ice did not always crush a vessel outright. Sometimes it simply refused to release it. That slower kind of entrapment could be even worse, because it replaced action with waiting and hope with calculation. Somewhere in that long Arctic silence, the expedition stopped being a voyage and became an ordeal. The men still had uniforms, duties, and procedures, but the mission was no longer moving toward triumph. Back in Britain, however, that transformation was invisible. Families waited, officials watched the calendar, and the expedition remained for a time, only overdue rather than lost. The longer no word arrived, the heavier the absence became. Exploration always carried risk, but this mission had left with such confidence that silence itself began to feel unnatural. Search expeditions were eventually organized, driven by duty, public concern, and the hope that Franklin's men had survived somewhere in the Arctic. Rescue, discovery, and national honor became bound together in the effort. But Arctic searches did not produce neat answers. They yielded hints. A campsite here, a report there, an object separated from its owner. A sign that men had passed through places where they were never meant to remain long. These clues were powerful precisely because they were incomplete. Each one suggested movement, hardship, and decision, but none could fully restore the missing sequence of events. Inuit testimony also became crucial to understanding what had happened. People who knew the region intimately described encounters, observations, and traces that outsiders would later treat as essential evidence. For years, the story of Franklin survived in this broken form. Official searches, remembered reports, scattered finds, and the stubborn possibility that the expedition had endured far longer than anyone first imagined. One of the most important discoveries was made on King William Island, where a written message was found in a cairn at Victory Point. At last, there was a direct voice from the expedition itself. The note revealed that the ships had wintered in the Arctic and then become trapped in ice for far longer than expected. It also recorded a devastating fact. Sir John Franklin had died in June 1847. By the time that message was updated in April 1848, the crisis had deepened beyond recovery. The ships remained fixed in the ice, and the surviving crew had decided to abandon them. That decision remains one of the most haunting moments in the Franklin story. To leave a ship in the Arctic was to surrender not only shelter, but the central structure that had made survival thinkable. More than 100 men now faced the polar landscape on foot. They carried boats, provisions, and the fading hope that movement southward might succeed where waiting had failed. It is difficult to overstate the brutality of that choice. The Arctic did not merely challenge the body, it reduced every mile to labor, every delay to danger, and every weakness to a threat shared by all. The retreat likely unfolded slowly, under conditions of cold, illness, and diminishing strength. What had begun as a naval expedition now resembled a desperate overland migration through one of the least forgiving places on Earth. Human remains and later evidence suggested that many of the men did not get far. The route away from the ships became, in effect, a final corridor of attrition where endurance was measured not in victory, but in distance gained before collapse. The Franklin expedition has often been discussed through explanations: ice, starvation, disease, lead exposure, scurvy, exhaustion. Yet no single factor explains the full emotional force of the story. What haunts the story is the sequence of decline itself. A mission launched with ceremony and confidence narrowed, step by step, into waiting, loss, retreat, and silence. Franklin had not led a reckless venture into the unknown without planning. That is partly why the mystery endured so strongly. If such a carefully equipped expedition could vanish, then preparation itself seemed less certain than people wanted to believe. The expedition's disappearance also belonged to a wider age of imperial ambition. Britain imagined the Arctic as a final puzzle of navigation and geography, yet the region answered with conditions that resisted control at every stage. In that sense, the Franklin story is not only about missing ships, it is also about the moment when a confident world met a landscape that would not adjust itself to human plans. Even the names of the vessels, Erebus and Terror, seem almost too fitting in retrospect. Yet the true power of the mystery lies not in their names, but in the stark contrast between confidence at departure and desolation at the end. For generations, people searched for closure in documents and relics, but the Arctic had preserved some things while erasing others, leaving investigators with evidence that illuminated the outline without fully restoring the lived experience. That partial recovery gave the Franklin expedition a special kind of afterlife. It was never a complete disappearance, yet it never became a complete explanation either. The long search for the ships themselves became part of the legend. If Erebus and Terror could be found, perhaps the Arctic would finally yield a more continuous account of the expedition's final years. Decades passed before that hope was answered. The mystery had already settled into history by the time modern searches began to uncover the expedition not as rumor, but as submerged reality. When the wrecks were finally located in the 21st century, they confirmed that the lost ships had remained in the Arctic all along, preserved in a cold silence that outlasted empires, reputations, and generations of speculation. Yet even these discoveries did not dissolve the mystery into certainty. Finding a wreck is not the same as recovering the thoughts, fears, and decisions of the people who once depended on it. The Franklin expedition still resists a simple ending because its final chapter was lived in fragments. One group here, another there, a note updated, a route attempted, a death recorded, and then no voice left to continue the account. That absence of a finished narrative is part of what makes the story so enduring. It does not offer the clean line of departure, crisis, and resolution. Instead, it leaves us with evidence suspended over silence. There is also something deeply human in the expedition's final effort. However doomed it may now appear from a distance, the retreat from the ships was still an act of decision, discipline, and hope made under extreme pressure. We often remember historical disasters through the moment they fail. Franklin's expedition is harder to grasp because it seems to have failed gradually, through many decisions that may each have looked reasonable before the final outcome became unavoidable. That gradual collapse gives the story a different kind of suspense. It is not suspense built around a single violent event, but around shrinking options and the slow realization that the Arctic is no longer something to be crossed, only endured. In this way, Franklin became more than a lost expedition. It became a symbol of how exploration could turn from confidence to uncertainty without any dramatic break, only a steady transfer of power from human intention to the environment itself. Even today, the names Erebus and Terror carry a peculiar weight. They belong not just to lost ships, but to the memory of a silence so prolonged that it reshaped how people imagined the Arctic and those who tried to master it. The expedition's physical remains have survived in part because the Arctic kept them. Wood, metal, bone, and paper endured in a place that destroyed the men who depended on those same materials for survival. That contradiction is one reason the Franklin mystery still feels so immediate. The evidence is real, tangible, and close enough to touch, yet the lived reality behind it remains just beyond recovery. In the end, the Franklin expedition endures not because it vanished without trace, but because it left traces that stopped just short of completion. A note in a cairn, ships in the ice, men on the march, and then the Arctic closing over the rest.